Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Well, hello again, everyone, and welcome to the final episode of Season 3 on the Global Missions Podcast. It has been a great year of learning and sharing together. I have learned so much through these discussions, these conversations with our guests. I have really been humbled and inspired by what God is doing and what He's doing through faithful servants around the world. And we certainly hope it's been an encouragement to you as well. On today's episode, we're now going to try something that's a bit different. We have with us today on the line a very special guest host, Mrs. Amy Walters. Amy, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Mags. It's good to be on.
We are glad to have you. Amy serves across the border in Send USA's office. And we're going to turn the tables in a few minutes. I'm going to give her the controls, and she's actually going to interview me. So we hope you find that interesting because we're going to go behind the scenes of the Global Missions Podcast, what led to the creation of this podcast, what it looks like to put an episode together, and what's on the horizon for Season 4. Just before we get to that, let me mention that throughout the summer, the Global Missions Podcast again will be re-releasing or replaying episodes that have been most popular. We call them our encore episodes, and then we'll be back again in September with Season 4. In the meantime, we would love to hear your feedback as listeners about this podcast. And we have put together a listener survey on the website inviting you to participate in the planning and preparation for next year. globalmissionspodcast.com/survey. You can find it on the website. We'll put it in Facebook as well. Would you take just a few minutes and give us your feedback? And we'll include a link in the show notes, all that stuff. We would appreciate your feedback and ideas. So, for today's episode now, our guest host is Amy Walters, who serves as the media director for Send International of the United States. And Amy, one of the things, before you were a director, I know I saw you do it many times, you did interviews, and you did video interviews, actually.
Yes, quite a few. My goal was always to make the interviewee cry, because that made for the most compelling interview.
Now, I did not know that, but I did watch a lot of those videos. Maybe I cried too. All kidding aside, just for a moment, I remember one video you did do, Amy, and it was about 6 months after the tsunami in northern Japan. And we'll include a link to that video. It's a number of years old now, of course, but it's a powerful review, both of the magnitude of that event for Japan and the way God was at work in those days and has worked forward since those days. So way to go for some really fine and memorable work. When we remember and appreciate it this many years later, you should be encouraged that the Lord has really used your ministry.
Thank you so much. It's been a privilege to go and talk to people all over the world and hear their stories about how God is working. And over and over again, I'm amazed at the work He does in people's lives.
Praise the Lord. Well, Amy grew up in the United States, in Illinois. She's had a passion for missions as long as she can remember. I learned this about you today, Amy, a bachelor's and master's degree in linguistics.
Correct. Yes.
Who knew? Linguistics. I did learn today also that Amy graduated from the same school that my son graduated from, Moody Bible Institute in Chicago.
Best school in the world. I'm a little biased, but yeah.
Yeah, a little biased. Yeah. We agree. Great school. Thank the Lord for Moody. She currently lives in Michigan with her husband, Aaron, and they have 2 precious little kids. Amy, I jotted down my summary this way. Amy is a valued and faithful colleague who has stepped up into some real challenging spaces. I say, way to go, and thanks for your positive and collaborative work. And especially now, thank you for being with us on this podcast. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Mags. It really is an honor to get to guest host the Global Missions Podcast. You and your team have put together some great episodes, great conversations. So I'm excited to have a little part of that in this episode. Any tips before I get started hosting?
Oh, oh dear.
I threw a curveball at you
Smile.
there. Yes.
Smile as you're talking to people because it tends to bring a great energy to the conversation. There's my tip for the day.
Very true. Thank you. I'll keep that in mind. Well, let's talk about this name that you have, Mags. It's rather unique. Where did this come from?
Well, it goes back to high school, actually. And my mom would want me to say she gave me a real name, so to speak. My given name is Rob Magwood. But when I was in high school, a dear friend of mine, Jeff, shortened my surname Magwood down to Mags. And it stuck. When I went to college, I introduced myself as Mags. And so since college, kind of college onward, most friends around the world and in the world of missions know me as Mags.
Well, it's great. It makes it a lot easier to not get you confused with other people. So, yeah,
Right.
it works
Yeah.
well. Yeah. Would you tell our listeners a little bit about your family?
Sure. I have a dear wife, Kathleen, who I met in Bible college. She was from the east of Canada. I was from the west, and we met at Briarcrest Bible College in the middle in Saskatchewan and studied there together. And we were married way back in 1992. And the Lord has blessed us with 3 great kids. We have 2 boys college age, John and Tim, and Anna is going into high school.
That's great. And you successfully avoided embarrassing any of them. So I'm sure they would appreciate that.
Well, I try, although Anna cautions me that I have great dad jokes and to please just save them.
Well, Max, you've been involved in missions for quite a while. Can you tell us a bit about your missions journey? How did the Lord lead you to participate in missions?
Well, the first introduction really that I had to missions was in my home church, which was Sturgeon Valley Baptist Church, way out in St. Albert, Alberta. But when I went to Briarcrest, my world was opened up. I learned more about missions, was introduced to biographies of missionaries, mission workers. And then especially important was a short-term team. After my second year of college, I'd graduated with a 2-year diploma. And I was part of a short-term team that went to the Philippines for the entire summer. It was 12, well, we were there for about 10 weeks. And I was mentored by a Filipino pastor, Mario Villanueva, and he just invested into me. And that was a key part of the Lord's work in my heart, to turn my heart toward the nations, to understand a little bit more about the breadth of this great world the Lord has put together with great cultures and peoples. I was introduced to poverty there in a way that I had never seen it before. And so that was a catalytic experience for me stepping forward. I would mention, too, that Kath was very interested in missions, and she was on that missions team as well. So that probably had something to do with my interest in missions.
Sure. You spent some time on the mission field. Can you describe that season of your life?
Yeah, we served first as an associate pastor in Western Canada, and then we moved serving with Send International, which is the organization we still serve with now. We moved first to Ukraine and served there. And then later, we had a short term in Russia as well, 1 year in length. And we served in church planting and in theological education. And so really, I'm a teacher by heart. And so to be involved in teaching there was a blessing. And then I was able to help equip other church leaders there, which was a great joy, humbling to have the opportunity to invest into others who then in turn took it forward far further than I ever could as a foreign mission worker. By equipping those Ukrainian and Russian brothers and sisters, they were able to multiply it much further than we ever could have done as a single family, as missionaries.
How do you think your time on those various fields prepared you for the work that you do now?
That's a great question, because it's, we were so stretched during that time. The first challenge was language study. We moved to Kiev in 1996, and we spoke just a few words, a few phrases really of Russian. We learned to speak Russian in those days and complement it with a bit of Ukrainian study later on. That was just what was deemed best in those days. But as someone who had served in ministry, I was immediately reduced to the level of a small child in communications. I couldn't talk to people fluently. I couldn't help people. Even shopping for simple things was a challenge and was embarrassing, frankly. And so we learned, I think, we learned a certain type of humility, and also not to take ourselves too seriously. That was very healthy. The Lord allowed a lot of challenges leadership challenges came along where there were unexpected adjustments. And sooner than we might have expected, we were invited to step up to help with things that might in some ways have seemed sooner than we would have planned, too soon maybe. But that was part of the Lord's plan to stretch us and to press us to depend on Him. And we also struggled as a family with our kids. I remember Jonathan being in a Russian school. We chose to have him in a Russian national school. So he went to school with Russian playmates and whatnot. And then in the afternoon, if he had energy, Kath would kind of homeschool him in English. But that was not an easy adjustment for our little guy to settle into a Russian school and how to love him and be around him. And of course, if your kids are hurting, then mom and dad are hurting. And just drawing us through those things led us to trust the Lord and to love each other as well along the way. Those are some of the things that came to mind. I guess the challenges are, we feel those things stretched us and made us more ready to serve others, hopefully with an understanding, with some empathy for what they're experiencing as they serve in missions.
Let's turn our conversation now to this Global Missions podcast, this program that we're listening to right now. It was one of the initiatives that Send Canada launched in 2015. Talk a little bit about what led to the creation of the Global Missions podcast.
Yeah, sure. We just see in these days that the tools are changing, Amy. And you know this, serving in your role as well, that some of the opportunities that we had for, I'll say, contact, to have presentations to God's people, to talk with them, have changed. For example, many churches used to have midweek meetings, and those were opportunities for missionaries to speak to a congregation often, or maybe a smaller group, prayer meetings and so forth. That has changed, and the dynamic has gone from usually or often a corporate meeting to cell groups or life groups, different churches call them. So there's a change there. Sunday evening services. Many churches do not have Sunday evening services anymore. And that's sometimes where missionaries could speak or could report. And so there's a real focus with all these change on Sunday morning and not as much opportunity to talk about missions. Understandably, all this makes sense. It's just a reality we needed to wrestle with. And so we thought, well, how are people listening? And podcast was, we're talking about it in 2014 as an idea, and it came to life in 2015. It was newer then, and we thought, let's give it a try. We said, we'll try it for 1 year and see how it works, and that's where it started, really.
Great. And have you had a lot of listeners in that time?
We have had bunches of listeners, which is great news. We're able to measure some things. It's difficult to measure a podcast, actually. We can measure downloads. How many times have our programs been downloaded? And that was one of our measures at the end of that first year, that we had measured, I think it was about 7,500 downloads. And in the internet world, that's not a huge number, 7,500, but it was enough that we felt there was momentum to invite others to join us. And so at that point, we actually called the pilot program something of success we would continue on, and we invited partners to join us. And this is kind of a real important piece, Amy. We called it the Global Missions Podcast on purpose and not the Send Podcast, because we wanted to keep barriers low. We wanted to keep the barriers to partnership low. If you can imagine me going to see a friend like John Fuller in OMF, he's the Canadian director of OMF here in Canada, and say, John, we've got a 1-year successful podcast. It's called the Send Podcast. Would you like to come and join us? It's a very unusual conversation. So we wanted to keep the barriers very low for partners. And so at the end of the first season, we offered partnerships to 6 different mission agencies who all accepted the invitation to come and join us. And we formed what we call the advisory group, and we went into season 2. So now we're at the end of season 3. And as far as downloads go, Steve, our producer, just gave me these statistics earlier today. Almost 70,000 downloads now.
Praise the Lord.
Yeah. So we're excited that people are listening. It's difficult to measure how long they listen. And so we'll have the listener survey over the summer as well. So listeners will have that opportunity to give us feedback. What we're really encouraged by, this last idea here maybe, is the subscribers. Over 1,000 subscribers. So that means that people are increasingly clicking subscribe on their podcast app.
That is great. What kind of feedback are you getting from your listeners and from the advisory group?
Well, it's positive, praise the Lord. The advisory group happily includes some millennials and some, let's say, older than millennials, because that's where I am. And we've got a real generational mix in there, so good input coming from there. And then we do have some listeners who are contributing as well. And that is such a great encouragement. If you are listening and you've got a word of encouragement, thanks for sharing that with our team. One came from a missions prof who is saying, I'm actually assigning the podcast to my students before they come to class. So they listen to the podcast episode and then come to class for discussion. Others are saying it's being used in their churches. Other ministry organizations are saying this is useful in what we're doing, and they're sharing it between the colleagues. So we feel like it's got some traction, that really people are listening and learning and appreciating it and just lifting awareness and hopefully inspiration for global missions.
That's great. Are there things that you're learning from that feedback that you're taking to change and adjust the Global Missions podcast?
Yeah. Well, we did make some, I would say, some fairly significant adjustments after the second season. We try and get content right to the front of our podcast. I have listened to some excellent podcasts, but there seems to be a lot of preamble on it. And we had feedback that said, okay, preamble, don't need a lot of that. So we tried to limit that, for example. We try not to be commercial about it. We include one little spot, if you will, a 30 to 60-second notice in the middle of an episode that just brings along a resource that we hope would be some encouragement and help to listeners, things like that. But generally, the feedback has been positive. I don't know, maybe our producer, Steve, is protecting me, but I haven't heard a lot of really negative feedback. I suppose people just go away, but most of it's been positive. We're thankful for that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, in a moment, Max is going to share more about what's on the horizon for season 4 and about a new missions resource in development called the Global Missions Toolbox. But just before we get to that, we'd like to share a resource that may be helpful to you and your church.
Are you looking to mobilize your church for global missions? Start by taking the Perspectives course. This course will give you a better understanding of the historical, biblical, cultural, and strategic aspect of missions. You can learn about the Perspectives course right here on the podcast by listening to episode 14. Visit www.perspectivescourse.org today to find a course near you. And now, back to today's conversation.
We're back with Rob Magwood, who's been sharing about his missions journey and giving us a behind-the-scenes look at the Global Missions podcast. Mags, tell us, do you produce the podcast on your own, or do you have a team that you work with?
Great question. No, I don't do it on my own. There's no way this could happen on my own. It's a team effort that gets this done. Way back in those early days, there were two organizations. It was Send Canada and the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives in Calgary, forming a management team. Charlie Cook, who's on faculty at Ambrose, was there. I was there. And then two other colleagues, Steve here in the office and Rebecca here in our office, all functioned together to bring the pieces together. Rebecca was with us for the first 2 seasons, and then she went on maternity leave, and a beautiful little girl that we were glad to celebrate, but that meant she couldn't come back to the podcast, so Steve had to do everything that Steve used to do, plus everything Rebecca used to do. He's a busy character, I'll tell you. But a big shout out to Steve, and thanks to Charlie as well as that advisory group. So that's our inner team. Go team.
So looking into the behind the scenes of the Global Missions podcast, what goes into preparing for an episode?
Yeah, it is a big job, really, behind the scenes to prepare. And so we start right with that advisory group in the creative phase. And we talk there, we get together a couple or 3 times a year, and we talk about themes that we'd like to cover. And so as we talk about those themes, then particular ideas come out. If we talk about member care, for example, caring for missionaries, then we did an episode that was caring for a missionary who's coming on furlough or on home service. So we kind of refine it into a topic. And then we try and identify a person or persons who we could interview with regard to that topic. That's the first stage, I would say, of just kind of generating the content. And then we reach out to a variety of potential guests. And some of them are authors, and some of them have a particular expertise. All of them have some experience in learning to share. And then there's a bit of an agreement process. Sure, I'd give it a try, or no thanks, or they maybe listen to an episode or two before they decide. And we craft questions. We use, Google Docs, and we create questions, lists of questions to start the conversation. And then we work together with that person we'll interview. Steve is the guy who does this, our producer. And behind the scenes, he, goes back and forth by email, or he'll set up Skype calls usually to talk with people and to just refine, okay, which questions are we going to try and cover in this particular episode? Yeah, that's behind the scenes, and all that needs to happen. We've got over 80 episodes now. And so there's a lot of work that has gone in behind the scenes. Again, for Steve and Rebecca behind the scenes, they have done a great job of making connections and getting set for interviews.
So you've done all of that preparatory work. You get to the day of recording. What's that day like? Are you doing vocal warm-ups and exercises?
Yeah. Well, I do some sit-ups, and no, I don't. I will actually, and I have it here today. I have a hot cup of coffee, which I kind of put down. It's my favorite, and just hopefully keeps my voice warm. We record using, we did use Skype in the past, and a Skype recorder. We use a Zencaster recording now. And Steve, the producer, is on the line during the entire time. If I were to put him on the spot right now, he's actually listening. And so Steve gets all the balance set up between the two voices. And I either sit, or now I actually prefer, I'm standing right now at my microphone. We meet with someone, the interviewee, I guess, who are our guest. We explain a little bit about it. We talk a bit. We go over the introduction. Are we introducing you properly? Do we have names pronounced correctly? Are we being careful of any security concerns that might be appropriate for that episode? We'd never want to jeopardize anything that the Lord is accomplishing because we've published something online. And then we record, which usually takes, to record a 20 to 30 minute episode takes somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes to do the recording by the time we do it all. And we have fun. I think it's fun anyway. I don't know. Amy, are you having fun?
I am, yeah.
Good. Okay.
And then, of course, it only takes one take to get everything right.
That's it, right? It's the one take, except for the other 63 takes. It depends, really. And sometimes we go from front to back, and it's one take. And then other times we just realize, we didn't ask that question quite right. What if we reshaped it, recast that a little bit? And our guests have been so gracious to be generous with their time. Some of these are busy leaders or authors, and they're in ministry. We've been very grateful for their generosity in sharing the time and sharing their resources too, and what they have written or what they have learned. Yeah.
Great. So after everything is recorded, what does it look like to pull everything together?
Well, again, I'll just point in Steve's direction and say we go to post-production. Hopefully it's been a pretty clean take and there's not a lot of shuffling pieces around, although Steve does a great job of that. I have listened to some interviews afterwards, Amy, where I'm like, that was the last question we asked, and it's now number 2 in the interview. And Steve has this gift to kind of see the whole thing and to draw the pieces together. And just does a great job of that. He does do some of the editing, although now we have others help us with the audio editing and things like that. Just speeds things along a bit because Steve's doing so much. But it usually takes a couple or 3 weeks to get that all taken care of. And then it will go into the queue. That prepared episode will go in the queue. And sometimes they are prepared many weeks in advance. We've recorded 6 or 8 weeks in advance at times, and it will wait in the queue. We do try and work ahead a little bit so there's not the pressure to publish too quickly. And the last thing, I guess, would be show notes actually are put together too. Highlights, Steve will do that. Rebecca did some of that. We've had others help with that. And there's another gal on our team. Her name is Amy actually as well. Amy out west. So shout out to Amy Martinez, who takes care of the social media stuff and Facebook and Twitter and stuff. She makes sure it gets posted out in those places. Last thing to do is just to let the interview guest know when it goes live. And so we always share it with them, send them a note of thanks again. And then if they use social media or their ministry is using some type of communication tool, maybe that podcast is going to be helpful to them somehow too. So yeah, that's kind of the rhythm.
Yeah, there's clearly a lot that goes in behind the scenes to create one episode, even of this. So thank you, everyone who's involved, for all your hard work. That's great. You've mentioned the first 3 seasons of the podcast. What's on the horizon for season 4?
Well, we intend to continue with a lot of the things we hear are working. For example, the pace of the podcast will continue to be every 2 weeks. The length of the podcast or the duration of the episodes is usually about 30 minutes. And we're pretty committed to keep it there so it doesn't leak too far beyond that. There are exceptions, but about a half hour in length. We are going to do that listener survey this summer. So if our listeners do have feedback, then you can visit the website or the Facebook page to get to that survey. Content-wise, a couple of things. We're going to try some more thematic focus. So this last year, we tried the short-term missions focus. It was several episodes all in a row on short-term missions, and we had some good feedback on that. So we're going to try some other themes that way. And we're also going to experiment with the idea of some geographic updates. I just recently returned from a trip to Africa where I met a number of dear faithful workers, both African and expatriate mission workers, who together I hope will give us a real great picture, an encouraging picture of what God is doing in Africa. And so that's an example of a geographic focus. And we'll go to different parts of the world to try and lift awareness of what God is doing in those places. And the other thing we want to increase is just the opportunity to engage the conversation around this. People will be welcome just to be listeners and just to listen to the podcast the way they do now. But we want to lift a little bit those conversation pieces so that people can engage with us.
That sounds great. We're looking forward to hearing those new episodes, hearing what's coming up on season 4. I understand, too, you've got a new project that you're working on called the Global Missions Toolbox. Tell us a little bit more about that. Give us a preview.
Well, we are really excited about this new project, which really is springing forward from some of the thinking that we've learned, things that we've learned from the podcast. You'll notice, first of all, the name, the Global Missions Toolbox. It's not named after any one mission agency so that partners can participate and listeners can participate. Others can not feel it's proprietary in any way. But the Global Missions Toolbox will be focused especially toward the senders. And it will be a place where senders can find curated online content to help them and their churches do missions more effectively. So the focus is actually toward pastors and missions committees, who at least in Canada here are usually volunteers. I know in many churches in the United States, the committees will be comprised of volunteers, and it will consist of resources and tools to help churches do missions better. I know that this material is available on the internet in different places. We're aware of that. You can Google, you can search and find that. But what we're trying to do is, instead of just going to Google, to provide a trusted place where you kind of know us a bit and you know what we believe and how we work. So trusted resources that have been tested by others and organized in an accessible way where you can just come and take what you need. We like the idea of the toolbox. You know, usually when there's a job to be done, I don't know whether you use your toolbox or Aaron has a toolbox at your place, but you don't usually use every tool in the toolbox when you get it out. You just need something specific. And so we kind of have that mind of providing a variety of tools that churches would say, well, on this occasion, we need this tool. We're doing short-term missions, so there's some tools for short-term missions. But over here, we have the member care tools. How do we really take great care of our mission workers that are sent out from our church? Well, we can use those tools today. Or maybe we're trying to build up our missions committee. We can use those tools. And that's the vision. Does it make sense to you?
Yeah, that sounds like a great way to help local churches really elevate missions in their own congregations and really help people engage in a new level.
That's the hope. It's the vision that we're trying to help the church as opposed to help us. If I can say it this way, and this is really important for the agency that I serve with, Send, and for the toolbox in particular. If I could describe it this way, that the church is the hero in the story, not the mission agency. Mm-hmm. And we exist as a servant, as a guide to be helpful along that way, not the other way around. Sometimes it gets confused, I'm afraid. Mm-hmm. And agencies, well, we can be misunderstood. We all want to serve the church, but we hope this will be really practical. It's based on research. It's based on things that we've heard and learned from pastors that have said, you know, if your mission agency was really helpful to us, this is what you would help us with. And that's what we're building. That's exactly what we're doing. And we hope that this will be an exciting new resource for them too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What can our listeners do to learn more about the Global Missions Toolbox if they're interested?
Yeah, at the moment, we're building our pre-launch email list. So the website is up, and it's possible to get onto the mailing list and learn about the pre-launch development. So it isn't a big website yet, but we've wireframed some of it out, and we're getting the content ready, and we'll launch it sometime later this year. But if you would like to know when it goes live, then visit globalmissionstoolbox.com, and you can sign up for the email list there. Yeah, we hope that people will join us and be curious about it, and then they'll be excited when we actually get to the launch point.
That's great. Well, Max, thank you so much for letting us put you on the hot seat this time and giving us a behind the scenes glimpse at how the podcast is put together. And I want to remind our listeners this summer, be sure to keep listening. You'll hear encore episodes of the Global Missions Podcast. And then coming in the fall, we have brand new season 4, that Max gave you a little preview of. Make sure that you tune in and listen to that.
Well, that's it for today, and actually for this entire season. The Global Missions Podcast 3rd season comes to a close and has been produced by the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our entire team, which includes Steve, our producer, and Rebecca, who did some production this year, and Amy on social media, and Amy, our guest host, and our advisory group, which includes SIM, Crossworld, Interserve, OMF, and Greater Europe Mission. Thank you for listening. Thank you for learning with us and growing together in God's work. We invite you to join us in 2 weeks for an encore episode, and then in the fall when we'll continue with season 4 to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.